Now, it's time for the Anchormen Podcast with Matt Gaetz and Dan Ball.
Welcome back to the Anchormen Show. We are here on location in San Salvador, El Salvador, and I've got a great friend with me that's going to walk through a lot of the flashpoints in Latin America right now. So you will end this episode knowing so much more about America's near abroad, and here's why that's important. A core feature of President Trump's foreign policy is to be less concerned about lands, oceans away, and more focused on America's true interests. And that means America's actual neighbors. What's happening in the Gulf of America is more important to America than what's happening in the Black Sea. What's happening in Mexico and Central America is certainly more important than how we assess an election in Russia or Ukraine. And so we're going to look at some areas where that renewed focus is creating pressure points, maybe even opportunities for success. And joining me for that discussion is my pal Herbert Esmahan. He's a political strategist here in El Salvador and watches a lot of these things closely. And you know, I really want to get into Venezuela and Colombia and everything going on there. But first, you also watch American politics closely. What would you tell my American audience about how folks in Latin America are viewing the Trump administration thus far?
Absolutely. Well, I can speak for the Salvadoran people as a Salvadoran citizen, and I can tell you that the Trump administration has been a massive game changer for Latin America as a whole, because under the Biden administration, Latin America was undergoing a lot of turmoil. There was a lot of friction. They had really bad diplomats that were really complicating things for governments all around. Now we see leaders like President Trump and President Bukele of El Salvador, leaders who put their people first. And it's very important to embrace these kinds of politics, at least for our nations, that have a long history of turmoil, as you know. These countries have been very violent countries in the past. Thank God El Salvador has surpassed that.
Yeah, and there was this thought about politics in America that if you wanted to get the Latin American vote, the Hispanic vote, you had to be for open borders. And if you were for strong borders, that would drive away this rapidly growing voter base. And instead, we saw something quite different. We saw that in even immigrant communities, people wanted to see a safer country, a more secure country. And President Trump got a higher percentage of the Hispanic vote than any other Republican in recent memory. Down here, is it the same? Do people realize that strong borders, strong countries will create more prosperity for people even who are never going to the United States?
Look, to look at it from a larger perspective, we have to go to the root of the problem. The main reason that most Latin American countries have a massive influx towards the U.S. of illegal immigrants is because of the conditions that Latin American countries are facing. For example, most Latin American countries have high crime, a lack of economic and educational opportunities. And that's what President Bukele here in El Salvador is now fixing for the Salvadoran people. In the past, Salvadorans had absolutely no future and a very high rate of possibly being murdered in their own country. Now that President Bukele has restored safety, security, economic, and educational opportunity for his citizens, there's no need for them to leave El Salvador. In fact, many Salvadoran citizens who have been established in the States for many years are now coming back. El Salvador used to be in the top 10 countries that exported immigrants to the U.S. border. Now we're out of that top 10 because our country has been restored. But that also explains, Matt, why the globalist institutions, most international institutions, quickly jump to attack any president that wants to restore order in Latin America. Because if you fix Latin America, you fix the migration issue, and a lot of them take advantage of that.
It's so analogous to the homeless situation in California. No one actually wants to solve the homelessness problem there because they want to continue to use it as a basis to raise money and have big salaries and grow large organizations and be little empire builders. And the NGOs don't really want a safe and secure and prosperous Latin America, because then you wouldn't need the NGOs, right?
Exactly.
They sow chaos, and they do it because they want to act like they're the firefighter, but the reality is they're often the arsonist in this case, and we see that play out. But there is, I would suggest, a real flashpoint coming in Venezuela, and I want to get to that. Throughout Latin America, what do people want to see happen in Venezuela?
Look, I think I speak for most of Latin America. The Venezuelan people have suffered a lot, and it's time for them to have a new beginning. However, I'm not sure what the correct approach would be for that, because let's say Maduro is forcefully ousted, for example. Would that create a vacuum such as what we saw in the Middle East that will empower criminal structures to take over, or would it be a smooth transition? These are careful points that we have to take into consideration. However, I do believe that communism and left-wing Marxist policies have come to an absolute end in Latin America. They brought nothing but crime and suffering. And even in El Salvador, we have experience with that, because before President Bukele, we had to endure 10 years of a socialist government, and that's when crime got worse than it had ever been.
Yeah, if there were U.S. bombs dropping on Caracas, would people support that in Latin America?
Sincerely speaking, that is a very difficult question to answer on behalf of a lot of people.
Yeah, but like the general vibe down here has been that whether it was United Fruit or Standard Fruit, you had a lot of U.S. interests that were destabilizing things. And frankly, a lot of the U.S.-funded NGOs did destabilize things and are still attempting to destabilize things as President Trump is ripping out the funding for them. And so I wonder if there isn't a latent resentment to U.S. involvement that President Trump shouldn't have to own. He wasn't there for it. He's not a longtime U.S. policymaker, but resentment that literally goes back to the days of like the banana republics and the banana wars, carried through to the NGOs, and now with concern over military intervention.
Look, what I can tell you is that based on my personal opinion, these are my thoughts. Sure. I think that each nation should be left to resolve its own issues. However, if the people can be supported in one way or another to be fortified, to be strengthened, even if it's morally, spiritually, and to take charge once again of their nation, then of course it should be done.
Well, and I think they've tried. I mean, they had these elections, and I have to say it was moving when I would see these elections officials knowing that they would be charged with crimes just for giving an honest vote, knowing that their families could be targeted. They came out of those voting precincts, they got on bullhorns, and they announced that Maduro was losing at the ballot box 3-1, 4-1, sometimes 6 and 8-1, to this little-known diplomat, Edmundo Gonzalez, who only, by the way, was the candidate because Maria Corina was not allowed to run over some complete BS fabricated thing. And so the people of Venezuela did show up and vote. Yeah. They voted against Maduro. Maduro simply had the military seize the ballots and announce a fake result. And so I wonder what tools are available for Venezuelans to fight back against this when the election there just didn't matter. And Herbert, I don't have the answer, and I'm not expecting you to either. But I think that is the decision tree that a lot of U.S. policymakers are going down. That if you just kind of allow this to happen and you don't put any pressure, then it will go to Honduras. You will start to see it more and more present in Colombia, maybe even Mexico. And I wonder, do you think he would ever leave? You know, do you think that the pressure on Maduro would ever get to the point as he's seeing the warships, as he's wondering what his own fate would have, where he would say, you know what, I'm going to take my stolen billions and head off to Russia or China?
Absolutely. You know, we both know that both President Trump and President Bukele are master chess players. They're master negotiators. And I do believe that the pressure that is being applied to Venezuela could actually result in a peaceful transition. I don't think there will be a necessary need to go the next step, as you could say. I do believe that Maduro could be pressured to a certain degree that he'll have to whimper his way out. His cowardice is going to kick in.
And I remember when a play was made against Maduro in the first Trump administration. And there was this theory among the key diplomats organizing it that you have to keep forcing Maduro to make decisions, right? If you bombard him with decision making that he has to do, inevitably when you make a decision, people second guess you if it doesn't go right. And so if you started to have more and more of those generals, the top military brass around him, second guessing a high volume of decisions, that may create the conditions for a Maduro departure that don't require kinetic force and Hellfire missiles landing. And I just wonder, at this stage of the game, Maduro having endured kind of the Juan Guaido experience, are the military leaders there really, really, really going to stick with him, you think? Or is there a breaking point where they could try to get their own payoff and get their own hide saved?
Sincerely speaking, we'll have to see how it evolves, how it plays out. But I want to go back, if you allow me, to something that you mentioned about election integrity in Venezuela. That's very important. What we saw in Venezuela is a clear act of rigged elections, correct? And that is why it's so important for models such as the model that we have here in El Salvador to be adopted by other nations within the region. El Salvador has the safest voting system. It's rig-proof. It's one of the most democratic.
You guys don't do mail-in voting everywhere?
We do not do mail-in voting.
Weird. And you're able to get the results of the election.
You know what the most important part is? We have voter ID. You have to bring photo ID to vote. You got to leave your fingerprint to vote, your signature. And apart from that, we only do paper ballots.
Wow, paper ballots. The third world has figured out elections better than the United States of America based on that model. But of course, in Venezuela and Honduras, we're going to see something different.
Yeah, and I must share something very important as well. I find it very hypocritical from international organizations when, I'm sure you've heard sometimes they want to accuse us of falsely being a dictatorship, when in reality, President Bukele has strengthened democracy in El Salvador. And they always fail to mention that every time we have a general election in El Salvador, all these international institutions are invited to come and see our elections. They have full access to every room, to every area where the ballots are being casted, where the ballots are being counted, together with representatives of every political party, apart from all the security measures that I mentioned to you. So this model is the right model to follow, and we have to make sure that other countries in the Latin American region adopt such models, because, when digital systems are adopted, for example, digital systems sometimes funded by organizations that have Soros money, it gets a little tricky, like we see in Venezuela.
Yeah, you think that there are actually NGOs in Central America that exist to undo some of those election integrity measures like voter ID, like signature match?
Absolutely, Matt.
It's so crazy to me. It's just so crazy.
I got to tell you something. A lot of the NGOs, a lot of these NGOs and human rights organizations and whatnot, they only serve foreign interests. You got to look at it from a geopolitical perspective. It's not about one nation. It's about the whole map. Yeah. And a lot of these organizations are complicit in, for example, drug trafficking and, for example, arms trafficking, human trafficking. Because let me tell you something. If you restore order in Central America specifically, which is El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, etc., you close that bridge between South America and North America. What does that mean? It's an alleyway that the cartels would no longer have. And President Bukele in El Salvador is leading the fight against drug cartels. El Salvador is the only nation in the region that's sincerely fighting drug trafficking.
Yeah, fighting and winning. I mean,
yes.
The drug traffickers are afraid to come to El Salvador.
Exactly.
I saw some deals. Some guys were just like selling some dime bags of marijuana down by the beach, and the police treated those guys like it was Al Capone. And I was impressed at the extent to which there's been a turnaround here. But so much now of the attention, of the energy is around what's going to happen in Venezuela and what the cascading impacts of that will be. I was watching something closely today, Herbert, about the military strategy. They are dispersing their military units out into the country, out into the jungle. And what that tells me is, in the event of regime change of any kind, what they're really going to try to do is create chaos and not have a centralized system. And I just wonder, like, is the military in Venezuela really going to turn on their own people? Like, that always is the question in these moments. And, we've seen the Iranian military turn on their own people. We've seen it happen throughout Africa. And I want to believe that there'd be enough sensibility where the Venezuelan military would see what time it is, would see the writing on the wall. Do you think that can happen?
Look, the people of Venezuela, as I mentioned previously, have suffered a lot.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, it is time for them to have a new beginning and for Venezuela to become an economic power once again, as it used to be back in the 80s before Hugo Chavez.
All the rich people I knew in Miami were from Venezuela. They had the best furniture. They had these incredible exports, gold, jewelry.
A very wealthy country, if not the wealthiest in the Latin American region.
Well, I now have seen this alliance that Maduro hopes to kind of lead alongside Cuba, creep toward Colombia. That's the next country I want to talk about with you.
Yes.
Gustavo Petro has got this video out where he's given some crazy speech and drool's coming out of his mouth.
Oh, he's a disaster.
His own foreign minister couldn't find him for 2 days in Paris because he was drug-addled and running around. The foreign minister has to resign when they get back because he has no confidence in the president anymore. I mean, should we think about Petro as a rational actor anymore? Maybe evil, but rational? Or is he just totally off the rails?
I personally think that Petro is definitely on his way out. I have a lot of friends in Colombia, influential friends, and everyone tells me that the people are not happy with the government of Gustavo Petro. That, a lot of Latin American nations give the benefit of the doubt from time to time to left-wing leaning parties, right? Like they did in Mexico, like they've done in Colombia, and like they sadly did in Venezuela. But they are quick to find out that the left is extremely ineffective, and it only brings a lot of poverty, and instead of fixing issues as they promise when they're campaigning, they worsen them, they enlarge them. And the people of Latin America are extremely resilient. I think we're going to see a massive political shift in the upcoming elections in Colombia. Of that, I have no doubt.
And if Colombia returns to the right, what should the United States expect out of that relationship?
I think you'll see more facility towards building a stable diplomatic relationship, because look at what Gustavo Petro did.
They're throwing out ambassadors back and forth. It's getting ugly.
No, and he went to the United Nations just to stand outside with a megaphone instructing the U.S. military not to obey Trump. And that's why I believe he got his visa revoked.
I've been around people who've done cocaine, and that kind of is the stuff that they do. That kind of crazy off-the-rails
behavior.
Yeah, grab a megaphone and go start yelling at another country's military. But with him in that condition, it sounds like what you're saying is there's a realization in civil society and in the military that this guy can't lead the country, and maybe that's one that isn't on a unidirectional drift left, but snaps back our way.
Yeah. Have you seen the Vice Minister of Women that he recently appointed?
Please tell me. Listen, I just hope it's a woman.
It's literally a man in a wig wearing makeup. So that tells you everything you need to know about his government.
It indeed does. But it is heartbreaking to see that happen in Colombia, because the United States put so much into that relationship.
Absolutely.
Plan Colombia had a major investment from the United States, but matched by multitudes from Colombia. And I thought that they really wanted to win their country back from the narcos, that they weren't going back to the days of Escobar and the like. I hope that's still possible. But what are your observations?
I believe that there is hope for the entire region, but there's something that's really important that we must all take into account, and that is the following: stability. What El Salvador is doing right now, what President Bukele has accomplished in what used to be the most dangerous nation in the world, the murder capital of the world, is required in order to be able to restore order. Because if you have a stable country, you can successfully fight drug trafficking. You can successfully fight criminal structures. And not only that, give a future, give hope to your own citizens. As you see, most of Latin America, it finds itself in political chaos, even neighboring countries. Like, for example, not too long ago, we saw over 20 gang members escape Guatemalan prisons in Guatemala from the prisons.
Like, is that an escape, or were they just let out?
That's a question we all have.
Yeah.
And if you restore order, you're slowly closing corridors for these criminal structures to operate. But that's why human rights organizations, Amnesty International, all these Soros-funded mediums want to keep these countries from finding order, from developing. Because if you have an unstable environment, it's the perfect environment for criminal structures to operate in without getting caught.
Yeah, and eventually the criminal structures get strong enough where they get someone of their own in the White or in the president's office.
They turn into shadow governments, which is what used to happen here in El Salvador with the previous governments, both the left wing and the right wing parties.
Yeah, what is it like? What is a shadow government?
They controlled entire territories, Matt, entire territories of the nation. They had alliances with the politicians of the past from both the right wing and the left wing. We're talking about the establishment, right? And every nation in the world has an establishment. El Salvador, thank God, managed to defeat it. I truly believe that President Bukele is God sent. I truly believe that he's been blessed with this divine mission to defeat this establishment, which was deeply rooted in Salvadoran government. And that's why we could never control the gangs in the past. That's why we could never have economic opportunity, and why our citizens were literally running away from their own homeland.
Yeah, and we could see that in a circumstance where war-torn Venezuela sends a bunch of refugees into Colombia. Those refugees start moving throughout Central America, and there are times when I do believe countries start wars like for the purpose of creating that type of refugee chaos. And so I wouldn't put it past Maduro to have a false flag event. I do wonder if this thing gets kinetic with Maduro, like does Colombia help him? Do they provide any kind of meaningful support? Do they provide refuge for different bandits that are going back and forth across the border? How far do you think Petro would go to back Maduro?
Well, with unstable leaders such as Gustavo Petro, the answer is you never truly know.
Yeah.
But I think they would definitely try to participate in helping Maduro somehow.
That's so crazy. All the money we've put. I think you're right. Like, I think you're right that they definitely wouldn't be on our side. Let's be honest. And so there would be directions from the Petro government to have Colombia helping Venezuela. And when you think about all of the money we put into getting the Colombian military capable, getting them pilots, getting them helicopters, getting them all these drug eradication tools, and now like to see that American materiel wouldn't be in a meaningful fight alongside America, it really shows how these relationships like can't even be bought. At times they're just rented.
Yeah. And sometimes we have to take into account that even if a nation seeks to do good, even if a nation seeks to establish proper diplomatic ties, there's always international organisms that are boycotting them. As you progress, you've got an international institution trying to boycott that progress. Sometimes they're not even from this region, not even from this continent. They're from overseas. And this is when geopolitics comes into play. There's a lot of interests. There's a lot of dark criminal money in these structures that needs to move. And as I mentioned previously, if you restore order, you keep it from moving. So you need an unstable region for these criminals to be able to operate.
How close do you think the drug cartels work with some of these NGOs? Like, do you think that they talk to each other? Do you think they just kind of read symbols of where people are doing operational work?
I don't think these NGOs necessarily work hand in hand with cartels, but I do think they
want the same thing almost.
I do believe they help create the conditions for these criminal structures to operate freely, obviously with dark purposes. And something
I wonder if the cartels aren't putting money into some of them, particularly on the caravan side. You know, if you've got an ability to move a bunch of product, move a bunch of people, overwhelm U.S. Border Patrol, I've always wondered whether or not there's there's crossover money because it's also opaque, right? If you run for office, if I run for office, the people who give us money have to, there's a disclosure of sorts. Mm-hmm. Whereas with these NGOs, oftentimes they're moving money from one shell entity to another shell entity, and that very dark purpose then emerges in their work.
And that's why it was so important when President Bukele enacted the Foreign Agents Law here in El Salvador.
Yeah, tell us about that law.
Because a lot of NGOs here and a lot of institutions, including a couple of digital blogs and newspapers, they were completely sold out to the Soros Foundation. Like, for example, the main opposition against El Salvador is you could call them a news medium, but I wouldn't call them that. I'd call them paid propaganda. It's called El Faro. And these guys, if you go on their website, everything's against our government, everything's against El Salvador, and you scroll to the bottom, and it says, funded by the Open Society Foundation.
Wow.
So that tells you everything you need to know. It's no secret. They're not even hiding it.
Will that be allowed under the Foreign Agents Law that you have?
Well, they would have to pay their fair share, of the donations they receive to the government, which is why they decided to leave El Salvador, and they set up, I believe, in Costa Rica, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure. And they're saying that they had to flee El Salvador, that they're being persecuted. They're not being persecuted.
There were people who did flee El Salvador to Costa Rica, and it was a lot of the gangs, actually, the ones who aren't rounded up in Sacat prison. Costa Rica has become less safe, and part of that, I think, has been the fact that El Salvador has become less tolerant of this criminal behavior, and they're becoming more tolerant.
No, not many gang members got the opportunity to flee. President Bukele doesn't mess around. He's a fafo kind of guy, F around and find out. So most gang members, El Salvador approximately started in around the early 2000s with 10 to 12,000 gang members, and the governments let it evolve. They let it evolve until eventually it was like over 100K gang members nationwide. As you know, you've been to Sacat yourself. About 80,000 of them have been captured and are going to be there for the remainder of their days.
Where are the other 20,000?
Where are the other 20,000? Probably in hiding, Matt.
Yeah, but I think that some are hiding probably in the mountains of Honduras. Some are hiding in Nicaragua. Some may be hiding in Costa Rica. But I do want to talk about the neighboring country, Honduras, a little more, because we have this election coming up. And this week on the Matt Gaetz Show, we talked to some of the candidates in that election, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of optimism that this is going to be fair. So let's imagine a circumstance where before the polls are even closed, the left-wing, socialist, China-aligned Zelaya government in Honduras just declares victory for their chosen candidate. If that happens, how will El Salvador react?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of the Salvadoran government, but I believe, Matt, that it won't be a welcome reaction from El Salvador, because we believe here in firm and true democracy. That is something that needs to be
where
clear.
Anybody can run,
where anyone can run, and anyone can be elected, and the people have the say. Not the state, not the NGOs, not foreign influences, just the people with their paper ballots.
Radical idea in today's world, my friend.
It sure is.
It shouldn't be.
It sure is. And if we see any kind of disturbance in neighboring elections, it's definitely something that we should be concerned about, and something that we won't be happy to hear about.
Do you think that you could see sanctions coming from El Salvador toward Honduras? I think the United States could sanction Honduras if this happens. I wonder if that would be broadly held.
Well, I'm not sure if El Salvador is necessarily in a position to do that, but I definitely can see President Trump taking action when it comes to that. And as you know, we have a very strong allegiance with the Trump administration, so I could see us following suit. This is just my opinion.
Yeah.
However, I must say the following, and it's very important to also mention, I find it so hypocritical, Matt, when you see these international organizations, right, try to sometimes call us a dictatorship, when maybe right now we're the most democratic nation in all of Central America, the most transparent. And not only that, President Bukele is the only leader in this region that has successfully stood up to Maduro and negotiated the release of 10 U.S. citizens that were in Maduro's prisons alongside 80 Venezuelan prisoners, political prisoners. So how dare they compare El Salvador to Venezuela when El Salvador is the only country in the region that has successfully, in alliance with the Trump admin, hit Maduro, and they hit him where it hurts, because that was his leverage. That was Maduro's leverage, those 10 American citizens, which he would probably be using right now as leverage against the U.S.
Totally.
If he still had them.
That's actually a brilliant point. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but we have this Tren de Aragua capture in the United States. Those folks spend some time in prison here in El Salvador. President Bukele says, fine, Maduro, we'll give you your people back, but in exchange, you have arrested a bunch of political prisoners here in Venezuela. You've arrested Americans, and you have to release your political prisoners. And it was a stroke of genius, and that would absolutely be a point of leverage right now for Maduro if Bukele had not taken that opportunity away from him. But thinking again about these Honduran elections, that are coming up, do you have any hope for the right? I mean, I wonder. I've had some friends of mine say, look, this the National Party has got a very charismatic candidate. Titos gets out there and yucks it up with the people, man of the people. Is there a vote that comes out maybe that nobody's expecting?
Look, realistically speaking, Matt, there can be hundreds of charismatic leaders. But it's not so much about charisma. It's more about, are they sold out to the establishment? Because what good is a right-wing leader, for example, if he's sold out to the establishment? The same thing, the same interests keep being served.
No, it's actually a really good point that I often become too binary about that. And I think, well, if they're a left-wing leader, they have to be aligned with China and Maduro, and we can't tolerate them. And so who on the right can win? And you're correct to point out that not all of those options are good options, that sometimes the people that line up on the right are just as willing to be bought off by China and corrupt and willing to allow gangs to murder people. And so do you see a champion emerging in Honduras?
Personally, I don't see that right now.
They don't have their Bukele yet.
I think you really can't clone Bukele. That would be ideal. A lot of people tell me we should clone your president,
Yeah, I got that.
30 years from now, we'll have one.
I do think that it takes the guy, or the gal.
Yeah, I understand.
I think that there was this fiction perpetrated that if you just had the right institutions, that those institutions would grow people who would be able to serve in these roles in a dignified and appropriate way. And the reality is, as we've been discussing, is the institutions then become Frankenstein's monster. They become the thing that perpetuates the violence and the poverty and the despair. And so now you see President Bukele come in and really limit the ability of some of those institutions to do harm to the people. And it took the guy. I mean, in the United States, it's a perfect analogy.
And just to clarify, these NGOs and whatnot, they're still allowed to operate in the country. As President Bukele himself said, I'm not banning them. So he shouldn't be called, as they want to label him, authoritarian or anything. He's just putting in place the same restrictions that the U.S. has put in place for these kind of NGOs, And as he's...
we should enforce them more in our country. I know this will shock you, but there are foreign countries that are attempting influence operations in the United States, and at times we're too permissive of that. And I think we could look to President Bukele's leadership as a shining example.
Yeah, I think it's time for the nations of the world, Matt, to reclaim their sovereignty, but the real sovereignty. Because one thing is coming out on Independence Day, waving the flag of your nation, I'm free, I'm a free man, and another thing is actually truly being sovereign. Being allowed to make your own decisions without having to ask for permission from people that don't put the interests of your citizens first. I believe it is extremely important to put your citizens first. That is the role of any elected official, president,
they all say it, Herbert. They all. Nobody ever says elect me because I'm going to sell out. They all say they're going to do it, and there are. We've been talking about these corrupt forces, George Soros, chief among them, who draw people away from that core promise that every politician makes. I want to talk about Panama too. This has been big time in the news in the United States. We just got a big deal done. Our ambassador there, Kevin Cabrera, is outstanding. And now we will be able to move U.S. warships through without paying these heavy fines and heavy tolls. When Trump was talking about the Panama Canal and repatriating it, was that something people were paying attention to here, or did that seem like a distant conflict?
Well, I can tell you, I recently traveled to Panama, and the Panamanians certainly were paying attention.
I know they noticed. Yes.
And you had a lot of mixed feelings on the topic, but as always, I believe that President Trump has his way, his strategy of negotiating on behalf of the American people, and he's been successful so far. He has his way of applying pressures that are necessary to people that might not seem too keen in actually being allies. But thankfully, for us in El Salvador, that's not the case, because we have a great friendship with the Trump administration. And allow me to tell you, this is not off the record. I was going to say off the record, but I'm on it. With the Biden administration, there was a lot of friction because they wanted to come to Central American countries and dictate what Central American countries were supposed to do. And personally, I'm against foreign nations, whichever nation it might be, telling other countries how to do their business, unless it's obviously something that's affecting said nation, right? But in this case, these are sovereign decisions that need to be made by Central American countries, and you had Biden officials come arrogantly to these countries to try and dictate what should be done. And a lot of Latin Americans, Guatemalans, Salvadorans, Hondurans, you name it, took offense to that. And with the Trump administration, we see a complete turnaround. We see an administration that's willing to actually be allies with our nations, with our Central American nations, and to cooperate as sovereigns, that have decided and agreed diplomatically to work together.
One of those allies is Argentina as well.
Absolutely.
And this has been all over the news in the United States. Currency swap, agreement on beef. Milei gets saved in the elections. It works. I guess if we had to do this, it really would have sucked if it would have failed and Milei would have bombed in the elections. But do you see Milei as kind of a Robin to President Bukele's Batman, or are the internal struggles there with inflation going to really kneecap his ability to be a more driving force in Latin America?
Look, I think Milei is great for Argentina, and each nation has its own problems, and they're the ones that know best how to solve them. As President Bukele has said, for example, in his recent Independence Day speech, he mentioned, in El Salvador, we created a game plan for Salvadorans made by Salvadorans, not from guys sitting in New York or Europe in an office that haven't touched ground in our country. And I think the same applies for Argentina. We see how Milei is working around the obstacles that he's finding, because we have to take into account when a leader such as President Bukele, President Trump, President Milei come into power, it's not going to be a shift. It's not going to happen overnight. There's a lot of institutional entanglements that they inherit from previous governments. And it takes a while. We saw it in the U.S. with President Trump during his first administration, during his first term. He had a lot of issues he had to tackle, and now he's got more the hang of things, Yeah. So
he's much more comfortable now.
Yes.
And maybe it's the Russia hoax isn't going on, and they're not trying to. His own government's not trying to throw him in prison. But it is noticeable, and it's interesting. You even see that from here.
Yeah, it's a transition that every government has to go through. Now, the key factor here is the leader wise enough to be able to see these knots, these institutional knots, and undo them, without alerting all the people that don't want these knots to be undone.
There's a whole infrastructure that is held together by those knots.
Correct.
And that infrastructure oftentimes is working against the people of the country.
Exactly.
We talk about El Salvador a lot, and whenever I mention it in the United States, invariably the conversation is, oh yeah, that's the Bitcoin country. That's
Absolutely.
The Bitcoin guy. When President Bukele comes into office, he has this massive Bitcoin adoption push, and Bitcoin drops substantially, and there were real concerns here. Take us to, we'll get to where we are now in this historic conference that the president is speaking at, but in those moments where Bitcoin was down, President Bukele was bought in, must have been pretty rough around here.
Honestly speaking, President Bukele, I believe that he always sees many steps ahead. So I didn't see any concern on his side.
Nobody was sweating?
Well, the opposition, obviously, they're trying to find something to attack him with.
Sure.
The minuscule opposition that we have in this country. However, even that didn't play out well for them, because right now Bitcoin went up, historic records, and El Salvador's profiting big time from it. I believe that it is a great alternative to gold reserves, but El Salvador is also purchasing gold now. I don't know if you heard that.
Yeah.
And I believe...
Don't tell the Bitcoiners. If the Bitcoin maximalists find out that you're into any other asset class, and you're dead to them. But I think it's wise to hedge real world assets with digital assets. I think that is the way people are going to be building investment portfolios going forward. And so, it drops. You say nobody was sweating. I'm not so sure about that, Herbert. But then we see Bitcoin rise in value. We see the bonds that El Salvador is issuing get far better treatment in the marketplace. And now the innovation around blockchain and cryptocurrency is finding its way to El Salvador. There is a major conference going on right now with a lot of folks in the digital financial space. What's it like having all of that focus and interest here in your country?
No, it's amazing, because in the past, Matt, at most, you'd have a couple of tourists that would hit the beach, come and surf, and risk their lives because we had gangs running loose, right, before President Bukele. I call it high-risk tourism back in the day. Now it's the safest option you've got. But it's really heartwarming as a Salvadoran citizen to see a nation that was once forgotten and doomed, I would say, to be completely restored, to have a rebirth, a resurrection, you could say. As you know, I'm a firm Catholic. I believe in Christ, and I think that God has given El Salvador a second opportunity for its citizens to not only build a future in their homeland, but to also send a message out to the world. And that message is that no matter how terrible your situation is, there's a way out, and that way out is God.
No question about it. And God's hand has been in this. The land literally named for the Savior, getting indeed saved in more ways than one, and having the smiles return to the faces of the people here is something that we'd like to see in other places. And just why we cover it so much and why we're so interested is because it's a stark contrast to the rise of failed states that we see elsewhere in the world. And we hope we're not seeing a failed state right next door to you. In Honduras, if this election goes bad, if there's violence, do you think that there'll be pressure, migratory pressure, where people will be fleeing Honduras into El Salvador? Well, and do you think El Salvador is ready for that?
That depends on how Honduras would handle their economy, because if their economy...
What if they just start killing people because of the election?
Do you really think it would get to that?
I don't know. I see what's happened in Venezuela where, Maduro loses, and then he goes out and says, not only did I win, but anyone who says I lost is an election criminal, and starts trying to lock him up. And by the way, that kind of harkened to a pretty dark period in the United States where if you questioned the election, everybody acted like you were a threat to the nation. And now you've got so many Venezuelans in Honduras. Do I think that could get violent? I do. And I hope that the progress here is not subject to some sort of external negative pressure that you didn't ask for, but that would be an outgrowth of this embrace of socialism.
No, El Salvador has found its stability, thank God, under Bukele's leadership. And I think, Matt, that regardless of what happens in Honduras, the Bukele effect is growing in the region. Each day, this domino effect is getting heavier, it's getting bigger, and more leaders are adopting policies similar to President Bukele's policies. Now, are they going to be as effective? That's what people might be asking. The answer is probably not, because they're still fighting with that establishment that they've got to take down within their own nations. In El Salvador, things occurred very specifically. You know, it was divinely aligned, you could say. The establishment was brought down, President Bukele came in, and that set the ground to be able to transform the nation. But if you still...
It's a blueprint. This is debated often. I debated someone on the show, I think last week, about this, because some folks say, well, you could only do that in El Salvador. El Salvador had the roadways you needed. It's got a densely populated populace. You know, you can't do that in Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras. And I call BS on that. Yeah. I think if President Bukele would have been the president of any of these countries that were in shambles and had... he would have inspired the popular support. He would have inspired support within the honest people in the government to do the right thing. And so I don't buy the excuses from the other places. You can be like this place. You can have the turnaround. You have to have the willpower. You have to have the competence. And then I don't think you're wrong. You have to have the hand of God that will guide you. But that hand is there for you. It is there for people. And we just have to embrace it and accept it. Herbert, we've been having this conversation. I'd love to know, what are some of your political influences? Where do you go to absorb the news, read the news? If we have listeners who are inspired to follow some of these topics, where would you direct them?
Absolutely. Well, I would invite them to follow our president, Nayib Bukele. And honestly, I'm a big fan of your show on OAN. I'll tell you that. I got a lot of my news from you, Matt.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And I am Matt Gaetz, the host of the Matt Gaetz Show on One American News. We're on 9 o'clock Eastern, 6 Pacific. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating and write a review so that you can continue to be part of our Anchormen community. And I am traveling, and you know I didn't come here without my travel kit I picked up from All Family Pharmacy. You go to allfamilypharmacy.com/Matt, use code MATT10, and then you are set. They've got over 300 medications, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, methylene blue. You can get your supplements there, and even prescription medications you might not know they had. The doctor gets the prescription lined up with you right away. It comes directly to your door, and if you're in a hurry and you absolutely need your meds, overnight shipping is also available. So as you prepare to head out and spend time with family and enjoy the holiday season, make sure you do so in full health and not sharing or spreading any germs. The best way to do that, allfamilypharmacy.com/Matt, code MATT10. Stand up for healthcare freedom. These are folks doing things the right way. Well, Herbert, I really appreciate the conversation we've been able to have this evening. I think when we get together and reignite our discussion, you're going to see very different circumstances in Venezuela, almost certainly, just with the rapid increase in pressure there. And I sure hope we see something better in Honduras. This left-wing coalition that we see in the Americas is something that must be defeated, not just for the sake of the United States, but I truly think for the sake of the people who live here, who have toiled for too long. I'll give you the last word.
Absolutely, Matt. I think that we're seeing a global trend, and where the days of cultural Marxism are coming to an end. There's a lot of battles that are being unleashed at the moment, and hopefully we will come out successful, because this is a time for common sense to reign. This is a time to get close to God once again. We must remember that the main pillars of Western society are Christianity. They've built Western society, and they have sustained Western society. And we're seeing a massive revival on all fronts, Matt. We're going to win.
And how can folks follow you on social media?
I'm Herbert Esmahan on every social media platform.
Herbert, you are an enlightened voice in these times, and we wish the best to you and to your country and to this region. And we certainly hope that folks will be joining us again for a future episode of Anchorman.
Want to see more great videos like this? Click on the link below to subscribe to OAN Live and watch Dan Ball's Real America and The Matt Gaetz Show on Dish Channel 212. Tune in, subscribe, and watch today.